Hello, I'm Julian and this is my friend Sandy. Let's have a bijou parlare about the influence of the Napoleons on food. Sugar beet. In 1789, the French colony of Saint-Domingue was one of the most richest and most prosperous anywhere. 8,000 plantations supplied 60% of Europe's coffee and 40% of its sugar. It also accounted for a third of the Atlantic slave trade. This all went away very quickly, firstly because when the French began their revolution with a stirring declaration of the rights of man, at least some of them acted on it rather than pretend it didn't apply to blacks. And the slaves themselves found out about it, and this all really rather destabilized matters into what became the largest and most successful slave rebellion in history. Secondly, even if the French had not shot themselves in the foot by making sweeping proclamations of universal human rights and then not being hypocritical about it, they ended up at war with the British, and in the way of things, this effectively meant that their trade with the Caribbean was soon down to nada. So they were anti-sugar and needed to find an alternate source. Saint-Domingue, by the way, is now known as Haiti and is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, for a variety of reasons, including that the restored French monarchy's understanding of reparations for slavery was to demand compensation for the loss of slaveholder property before extending diplomatic recognition, and the resulting loan crippled the Haitian economy for decades. Now, the Germans, specifically the Prussians, were ahead of the game in finding a solution to imported sugar, because they never had very many colonies of their own and had lost, sold, or abandoned the few they did have. Andreas Sigismund Magrath had identified that beets contained sugar as early as 1747, but this was not acted upon, and it was left to his student, Franz Karl Achard, to turn this into a workable process and set up the first sugar beet refinery. This burned down in 1807, possibly connected with Napoleon utterly destroying the Prussian army at the time. Achard died destitute in 1821. This will be a recurring theme. His work, however, did gain the interest of Bonaparte, who sent a team to check out Achard's work and conduct some experiments back in France. In 1811, he assigned 1,000,000 francs to the setting up of sugar schools. In 1812, he decreed that farmers had to plant a minimum area of beets, and in 1813, he forbade the importation of cane sugar. By 1837, long after Napoleon's death, France had become the largest producer of sugar beet, a position it would hold into the 21st century. Canning. Okay, Boney isn't directly involved in this, but it partly takes place under his government, so I'm going to count it. You like cans, don't you? In 1795, the French revolutionary government of the time, the Directory, offered a prize for anyone who could provide a means of preserving food so it could be transported to the army, as even the revolutionary armies couldn't always rely on foraging. A decade and a half, and a handful of coups later, when Boney is in charge, one Nicholas Appert claimed to have found a solution. Now, people have been preserving food since forever by such methods as salting, sugaring, drying, smoking, pickling, and fermenting, but these could only be applied to certain foods in certain conditions and were not necessarily consistent or portable, and all of them affected the taste of what you were eating. Appert's insight was that if one could store wine by sealing it and excluding the air, one should be able to do that for anything else. But he also discovered that he had to heat the sealed glass containers in water for several hours. He did not know why this worked, and no one would for several decades, but it did work. Trials of the French Navy proved successful, this being possibly one of the very few occasions during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars when the words successful and French Navy would be seen in the same sentence. And in 1809 he was offered the choice of a patent and royalties, or 12,000 francs grant on condition that he publicised his method. He chose the latter. He then invested the money in his factory in Massy, but unfortunately this was wrecked by Allied troops during the fall of Napoleon, and he was in any case not a great businessman, having already declared bankruptcy before. He started again and switched to tin plate rather than glass, but never found commercial success, despite his product line including the very first condensed milk and a 17-kilo can of corned beef. He would ultimately die in poverty in 1841. Before we move on to the third Napoleon, let's handle a few minor anecdotes and legends. Chicken Marengo. According to legend, this sautéed chicken, crayfish and tomato dish was invented on the battlefield of Marengo from what his chef Dunand could find after the victory. This is probably not true, not least because Dunand was working for the exiled Prince du Conde at the time and didn't enter Nappy's service till 1805. Also, I have a hard time believing that crayfish are something you're going to find lying around on a battlefield, and I'm not sure I'd want to eat any that someone had scrambled up in such a manner. Omelette de Béziers. Béziers is a place in Haute-Garonne, France, where Napoleon once allegedly passed through. He so enjoyed the omelette that was prepared for him that he made the village prepare a giant omelette for his entire army the next morning, because they just happened to have a giant pan, a bunch of huge spoons, and a stockpile of several thousand eggs lying around. What happens today is that the local confraternity get together on Easter Monday to cook a giant omelette that they distribute to the local population. This tradition dates all the way back to 1973, and soon afterwards they formed the Confrérie des Chevaliers de l'Omelette Pascal de Béziers, which in turn inspired the worldwide Confrérie des Chevaliers de l'Omelette Géant, where people make giant omelettes across the francophone world. Lobster Thermidor. This is nothing to do with him, and the only reference to it being anything to do with him I happen upon is someone refuting the idea that it is, because you can safely treat as BS any sentence that begins "legend has it." Sounds like someone trying to pad out a list. Napoleon Brandy. He was not a spirit drinker. In fact, he even drank his chambertin with water, but Napoleon Brandy has had an odd history. Even Courvoisier, who featured the little corporal prominently on their merch, prefaced the account of his taking several casks of cognac into exile to St. Helena with the "legend has it." Also, we should point out that even if he did, it would not have been theirs he took, because they were not making the stuff at the time and did not move their HQ to Jarnac till 1828. By the early 20th century, Napoleon Brandy had come to mean two very different things that suppliers were very, very poorly motivated to distinguish. On the one hand, it was a term of quality. On the other hand, brandy that had dated back to Napoleon's day, the latter proliferating in a manner akin to fragments of the True Cross with about as much veracity of provenance. In any case, it's a highly dubious concept because, unlike wine, spirits do not improve in the bottle. And then prohibition kicked in the US and standards went completely by the wayside. Napoleon is now standardized as a cognac containing no brandy less than 6 years old. This therefore puts it firmly in the middle of cognac categories, above VS and VSOP, but below XO and XXO. Napoleons. Now, I know these as mille fois, or 1,000 layers, because I've been living in the Francophonie too long to refer to them as custard slice anymore, and was unaware anyone actually called them Napoleons until researching this episode. In any case, these are considered to derive their name from Naples by Neapolitans and therefore have as much to do with Napoleon as Neapolitan ice cream. Hello, Glacier. Did someone say ice cream? You don't like ice cream. Well, actually, you've never had ice cream. But you're called Glacier, so you might like ice cream. This is even more true of layered dishes derived from the above, such as eggplant Napoleon, which is definitely nothing to do with him because only Americans call them eggplants. Margarine. We skip forward now to Napoleon I's nephew, Napoleon III, who, after being elected president in 1848, launched a self-coup in 1851 to avoid giving up power and became emperor a year after. Now, he was after an alternative to butter for the military and poor, and a chemist named Hippolyte Mézières-Murier was able to provide one combining beef tallow with skimmed milk. This was met with approval and financial award from the emperor, and mass indifference from the French population, whose reaction can be summed up as "Je pourquoi ce n'est pas la beurre." Unfortunately, he gained this reward in 1870, and his attempts to commercialize his invention fell foul of the emperor following the family tradition of picking a fight with the wrong people, in this case Bismarck. This worked out about as well as it did for anyone else who tangled with Bismarck, and after losing the Franco-Prussian War, he continued the family tradition of dying in exile. The Prince Imperial, Napoleon III's son, joined the British Army, flirted with Queen Victoria's daughters, and after graduating Sandhurst went to South Africa, where he was killed by the Zulus, which is one reason there has never been a Bonapartist restoration, because all the subsequent claimants have been kind of rubbish. This has no bearing whatsoever on what we were talking about, I just wanted to share. Mézières-Murier, meanwhile, continued the tradition of people appearing in this video by never really profiting much from his invention and dying poor. Margarine has never become very popular in France. They only consume 2.4 kilos per head, whilst they remain the world's largest consumer of butter at 8.2 kilos per head per year, which is more than 25% more than the next base Danes. While Mézières-Murier's method differs from the hydrogenation process used in modern margarine making, one could make a case that Napoleon III is indirectly responsible for a higher body count through trans fats than his uncle is through battle.